I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Nayantara Roy has written a family saga that is, well, it's a full body reading experience, y'all. This is so fun. The Magnificent Ruins, it's her debut. We are going to dance around spoilers in this one because there is a big cast. There is an unexpected inheritance. There's all sorts of stuff, but there's a lot of family secrets, and it makes for great reading. The other thing you should know is, well, Tara goes by Tara. So if you hear me referring to her as Tara during the show, that's why. Anyway, Tara, I'm so happy to see you. Thank you for joining us on Poured Over.
I'm so excited to be here.
So, hey, this book is set in 2015, and you're cutting between Brooklyn and Kolkata, India. And I'm just wondering, why 2015? And we're going to get to the characters and the inheritance and everything else, but the 2015 felt very deliberate to me, and I'm wondering how we got there.
It was, I really wanted Lila to feel, I'm practically quoting the book here, but to feel the safe assurance of the Obama years that I felt in that particular period of time. I also think, and I've heard other authors say this, it's almost impossible to write about the time that came after Obama without really sort of submerging oneself into the politics of the time and into the time marker that the pandemic presented. But I think, without giving anything away, there's an election in the book that happens in India. And in many ways, I think Lila feels like she's a little above it when she arrives. There's a sense of safety that democracy, she is American and democracy is hers. And this country that she left behind is not fully comprehensive to her.
Yeah, I get it. I was in India in 2009 for a wedding, and I have never experienced anything like it. And I was in Delhi and Lucknow, and I was very happy to be there, but talk about being an outsider. I have never been anywhere like, I would like to go back at some point, but I've never been anywhere like it. And I've done a lot of traveling. I've been really fortunate, but nothing compares to India. So Lila, our protagonist, Lila.
It's so specific to be in India. Globalization it isn't real to you until you hit India and the juxtaposition of that. And Lila's very much aware of that.
I really like Lila. I really like her. And it's not just because she's an up-and-coming book editor in Brooklyn. I think she's got a great voice. And I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about her origin, sort of how you came to write The Magnificent Ruins, because she is a great character. She's also, she is very aware that she's standing between two giant cultures, right? And working in books, technically we are sometimes at the forefront of culture. So, yeah, how did we get Lila?
I think, I was living in Brooklyn and going to Columbia, where the book was born for grad school. And I think I was alongside a lot of first generation immigrants who sort of echoed all the things that Lila did. We were footloose, fancy free, yet deeply preoccupied with our notions of the world. And I can definitely say that, that era for myself was, one foot in my identity and another in this shape-shifting person that I was becoming, because so much of your 20s is a becoming. I think I always knew what I wanted the book to be around, but the birth of Lila, I think Brooklyn brought it alive in me in a way that this is where she really makes her big decisions.
But here you are, you're at Columbia. I didn't realize you were at Columbia getting an MFA. So, you're based on the West Coast now. You work in film, which we will come back to, because there's, we're running on parallel tracks with storytelling here, right? Two different kinds of storytelling. But, this is a big, meaty, satisfying novel. We've got mothers and daughters. We've got aunts and uncles. There's a whole family living in this house in Kolkata that Lila's grandfather leaves her. And she is not expecting this. And I love the idea of it. I love what you do with it and the characters. It's just wild. It's completely wild. So let's talk about structure for a second. How did you decide that this was going to be, because I've heard a little rumor that maybe there's a little bit of your own family's story in this, maybe a little bit, just a tiny bit.
The rumor mills are alive and well then. I mean, I think like most debut novels, what are the thoughts and things that preoccupy you the most? And I was actually getting my MFA in film and TV, but the novelist in me was very much kicking to be let out. And I took this class called Other People's Secrets, which was taught by Benjamin Taylor, the professor there. And it was a remarkable class. And what sort of tumbled out of me at the end was a mother-daughter story. And it would be remiss for me to say that, the reasons for my writing the book was to throw light around the cultures that Lila feels caught between. It was also when I wrote that initial Genesis, I realized that no one talked about the sort of shroud of silence around these old historical families or a very specific kind of violence that existed in the country that I came from. And when I spoke to cousins and family members about it, they were like, that's just how things are done here. And then I had conversations because I was in graduate school, the only time in my life that I've had the time to do some lofty thinking on my own. I think it was really sort of understanding that my African American friends felt similarly in some pockets of their culture. And my Chinese friends were like, well, this is our version of it. And I had a lot of conversations, and I'm speaking around something, but really there's a pivotal reckoning with violence in the book that Lila has to uncover, for herself. And it comes in many forms. So
yeah, I'm going to quote a line of yours back at you, but everyone in New York was ravaged by their love affairs and debt and childhoods, by race and geography and loneliness. In Calcutta, people had fewer problems because one did not talk about them. And I was like, oh, right. I have family in Asia. I recognize this, but I also have family in New England, so I recognize it there too. It is a cross-cultural phenomenon. If we just don't talk about it and pretend it didn't happen, it didn't happen.
Yeah. I once dated someone from Maine who was like, oh, I get it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, Maine. Oh, yes. Absolutely. But part of the fun is you give Lila this, he's a hot author, and he's hot in two ways. His career is taking off, but also he's very pretty to look at. And they're having kind of a fling, and it turns out he actually wants more. And it's not often, that we quite, we've been trained on this sort of cultural moment, right? Where it's like the men should do the chasing, not the women. The women always want to settle down and da-da-da-da. And Seth is, I don't feel like I've met a character like Seth recently.
I think Seth is based on a few male friends and people I've dated, as well as sort of the character that I imagine Lila would feel most at ease being with. There's so much closure that Lila hasn't had, that to be in something that feels sweet without too many demands from her feels appropriate at this juncture. And Seth provided that base. However, when Lila disappears from his life, what Seth feels like he must do, however that works out for him, is interesting. And it's also, I wanted to see someone else's POV of that post-colonial zamindari world in Calcutta.
And he's a little unprepared. I think that's the best way to, we like Seth, but he's a little unprepared.
Sure is.
But Lila and her family, and she loves her grandfather. Her grandfather loves her. He dies sort of unexpectedly, but sort of not. We are talking about a grandparent. It's not like, But you're juggling Lila's story, her family in the States, her best friend Molly, and Seth. And then there's some other stuff that we're going to dance around that happens in India. But it's a big cast. It's a really big cast. How many Post-it notes? How many Post-it notes? How big a whiteboard? Come on, spill.
And you have to understand that I was doing this while I very much was plunging headfirst into a career in film and TV, well, specifically TV in my case, and there wasn't the room for too many Post-it notes.
Oh, seriously?
There wasn't even the room for too many whiteboards. I had two things that really served me well. well, three. One, a deep understanding of what I knew the story was going to be at its central core about. Two, I really managed to use the conflation of several characters into composites of themselves, because in reality a sprawling big family like that is double the size of what it is in the book. And so really distilling it down to its essence, even though it feels sprawling, I did that just in Google Docs, understanding each person's arc and so on. And then three, I had an author friend who, Sunil Yapa, the novelist, he and I are friends, and we sort of write along the same lines of immigration and identity. And he was like, well, send me what you've got so far. And I was like, oh my God, it's a sprawling, rambling mess. But he read it, and then he proceeded to have some conversations with me that really were very meaningful in what the central core was. And that really helped. Those were the post-it notes in my head.
Okay, fair. Listen, post-it notes can be metaphorical. I mean, or in my case, they are not. But I have a giant computer monitor at the office that's just covered in post-its. I map out my life in post-it notes. But post-it notes, metaphorical or Google Docs or what have you, you're also keeping track of all of these secrets, though. I mean, so you've got to do the whole cause and effect and figure out where best to reveal. I mean, you're engineering a story. And you've got, I mean, it's obvious that you have worked on the screen as well. And I do want to sort of tie the two together. I mean, there are some cinematic set pieces in the book. There are some moments where I'm like, oh, I cannot wait to see that on the screen. Mm-hmm. So you're actually combining two different arts that are similar, but not twins. So can we talk about pulling from all of those places and how you made it work without sort of putting one over the other? Because you kind of need both.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think a love of books means that you're starting to think in chapters, right? And the way television works, and I've worked in television for my career, it works in episodes. And I think that definitely, that understanding of the fact of pacing, the fact of things requiring to be saved for a certain act versus another. And I also went to screenwriting. Like in graduate school, I was very much also a writer. I presented as a writer as much as a producer. And both those skills served me very well in both places. But what I would say is that I started writing the book when I was a baby in my career, right? And it came to fruition as I sort of really ascended. And I think it's a good thing because it doesn't feel too much like television. And neither is it, I think it doesn't, there are some very unwise decisions in it for a debut novelist to make, but they have worked for me.
Okay, like what? I mean, we can just pick a couple of things. I'm curious to see what you would describe those as.
Well, my friend called me the other day. He had just finished reading it and he was really emotional because he knew me in those years. And he was like, you would think it wouldn't work to switch to the POV of this outsider at this point. And yet it does. If you had come to me with that idea, I would have told you, absolutely not. Just write a sane novel, for God's sake. But, in many ways, it is not a sane novel.
Well, okay. I mean, it's ambitious, sure. I mean, you clearly, though, I mean, you just said this a second ago, that you were deep in the material. I mean, secrets are a fun way to approach art, right? Like, how do you drive the story forward? How do you give everyone skin in the game? Right? Pardon the bad sports metaphor, but it's the best one that I have right now. But essentially, we've got Lila trying to figure out what the secrets are. And part of the secrets, honestly, are back at her job in New York. I mean, technically, she's working remotely for 8 weeks in 2015, which was practically unheard of. Her company has been bought by a bigger entity that some might recognize, even though it has a different name. And that's all I'm going to say here. But she's trying to figure out also initially she and Seth are like, well, we have this code, and if he doesn't text me back right away, then I know he's with someone else. But all of this game playing, all of these secrets, everyone holding on to their tiny piece of information in the corner. It seems like it was very fun for you to map this out.
You ask excellent questions. I mean, I
Well,
just
thank
just
you.
just the way you think about things, you're so right, and you don't always do it consciously as an author, right? You're not always thinking everybody's holding on to their secret in their corner, right? But you're so right. That is the atmosphere of the book. I was very lucky to work with my beloved editor, Kathy Boris, who had an intimate knowledge of what it was like to be absorbed by a bigger company. And while their experience of it has been positive, and I would argue that Lila's, in many ways was positive as well, there are many pluses. I think she's very clear eyed about what it means. And having worked in the industry that I do in my day job, I know only too well what mergers and acquisitions feel like. And I've been able to channel that very accurately.
I think it's also the world we live in, right? Like you're just trying to figure out where does work fit? Where does life fit? Where does family fit? Where does dating fit? I'm not saying it's all compartmentalized, right? But this idea that, sometimes you can figure out a manual for living if you read enough, and sometimes you're just like, I have no idea what's going on. I'm just going to throw my hands up in the air and make it up as I go along. I like this character. I really like her. I think that's what it comes down to. I really like this girl and watching her figure out, because she's in her 20s. She doesn't know what she doesn't know, but then we find out. But working across generations, right, especially for the pieces set in India, I mean, you're dealing with a certain kind of man of a certain age and a certain class. I mean, there's a little bit of research that went into this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the world that Lila finds herself suddenly back in intimately. I myself am Bengali, and I am from family on both sides that have legacies in Calcutta. And it was not hard for me to write that world. It was hard for me to make sure that it was not just my world, but it was Lila's world, which is a fictional world that is almost richer, has different facets that are not, quite my POV. And I think the sense that I had to be really able to tell the stories of the mom and the grandmom with as much fairness as I was telling Lila's, that was my inheritance. I felt the burden of responsibility while writing that.
If you look back at all of the women who came before you and I, right, which wherever our families might be, it's kind of amazing that we're where we are, and yet at the same time, it's like, wait, shouldn't we be further? And we think back to our grandmothers and our great grandmothers and great aunts and all of this kind of thing, and it's like, what is going on?
Yeah.
And again, all of your characters, and readers will discover this as they go through the book, everyone has actually a very clear motivation. And it's mostly when those motivations intersect that we get big bouts of story, and it's very fun. And that's not to make light of the fact that, yes, there is some serious stuff in this novel, but that's the whole beauty of, a multi-generational family saga. You get the comedy, you get the tragedy, you get the drama. I mean, you get all of it. And all of the character development as well. But you've been working in television now for more than a minute.
Yeah, it's been a long minute, since 2017.
Okay, so how did you decide on television as your storytelling medium, sort of choice? Let's call it of choice, because here you and I are talking in 2024 about your debut novel, which you have been working on, sort of consistently across time. But you did make a choice sort of early on. I mean, you went to school for film and television. So why that storytelling over books until now?
I don't know if you'll relate, but I suspect you might. My cousin is a novelist. My grand aunt was a novelist. My mother is a talented writer, though she's not a published one. I won prizes in school for writing. I was the editor of my school magazine. That was what I wanted to do. And it was very clear to me, coming from a family of, finance folks, that I would need to really figure out a way to also support myself,
Right.
And when you come from a South Asian family, there's very little romance to the idea of supporting myself, So I was like, I want to find something I love doing and I love what I do, but I also would like to continue to do what what I really wanted to do. And so I never gave up on the idea of writing the book. I've recently finished my second, and it just has felt very much like, oh, I can be both. By the way, you should give yourself permission to be whoever you want to at any point in time. I don't know how you feel, but I definitely felt the pressure of my family's expectations around what a career looked like.
Yeah, my parents were not expecting me. Hey, I know you think I'm taking that other job, but guess what? I'm going to go be a bookseller. And Christmas was awkward for a couple of years, and then we got over it. But yeah, there is a little bit of, that's what you're going to. Yeah, it's a long story, but that's sort of the Spark Notes version of. Yeah, I know you think I'm going to zig, but I'm going to zag over here. So see you in a minute. But let's talk about literary influences for a second. I love this idea of other people's secrets as a class. I studied history. We didn't have class titles like that. But the idea of that is pretty great. But there have got to be other influences too. So can we talk about the books and the writers and then maybe bring in the film and the television if that's part of the conversation too?
Yeah, and the Columbia Writing Program had some titles like that for classes and some places to really let your mind spark. Well, I would say Vikram Seth was my most profound sort of influence growing up. Literary fiction that told Indian stories that were written in English, but with such a fluid, poetic light.
Remember A Suitable Boy? I mean, when that came out, it was like...
Profoundly so. I remember, but I also loved his Golden Gate and his, Unequal Music. Some of the greatest writers in the English language were working out of India, but he really meant something to the way I saw narrative unfolding. And I would say, I love Anne Patchett in the same way, and I love Elena Ferrante in the same way, and Jumba's work makes me stand back and gasp every time. And Paul Murray just wrote a novel about
the bee sting. Are you kidding me? That book. I had convinced myself that book had no punctuation. You know what I'm referring to, but I'd convinced myself that the entire book did not have punctuation because it was so seamless. And then I went back and I was like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, hi, I told myself it. But the voice in that book. So you're reading for voice first, aren't you? I mean, you're not reading so much for story.
Well, you have to understand, I read constantly. I read for work. I read for pleasure. I read for, reference. And so I am constantly privy to, because I'm also working in I'm reading books all the time for my day job. I'm privy to the way writers approach things. And you're so right about the beast. It feels like one endless breath, right? I don't know that I'm looking for anything but the way a novel makes me feel. But I'm drawn to themes of family sagas and sprawling intergenerational. I'm also drawn to blended families these days, I've noticed in my reading.
Yeah, blended families are the future, y'all. I mean, the future is now. And I do think there's an opportunity. Sometimes books take a minute to catch up because it just physically takes longer to produce a book sometimes than it does to produce a film or a TV series.
Yes.
I do feel like I've seen a lot of sort of traditional family stories, and it's like, well, stuff gets really interesting when you add all of these extra sort of, how do we navigate this, right? Like, how do we navigate anything? I'm reading for voice first, always, and I'm forgiving if not a lot happens, because as long as the voice is there, I will go. But, everyone has their thing.
Yeah.
So I have sort of two different modes. There's reading for work, and then there's reading for, I'm revisiting something, or I'm noodling, or I'm just reading for pure pleasure, which I don't get to do as much as I would like, but still can't complain about the day job. But I do find that I switch between sort of different criteria, as it were. If you're reading for adaptation, though, it's not just voice, right? Like, you need to be able to sort of pull it apart at the seams and in a way rebuild it, right? Because you're never going to do it's never going to be a line for line Like, even if you're Baz Luhrmann doing Romeo and Juliet, you're still taking stuff out because otherwise the film is 9 hours long and no one's going to finance that. So, what's the marker for adaptation?
Yeah. I'll preface it by saying it's a really tough climate, for television. The industry is shape shifting. Money is tight as it is around the globe in different industries. And the bar is much higher as it should be because writers have better deals in post-strike, right? With that said, I constantly find myself in the position of having for pleasure read a certain hit of the season, and then it's on my desk as a submission, and then your brain flips and says, there's that elegant, perfect voice and ideology that this writer has given birth to, but it is an entirely different beast when it transforms into this other medium that includes acting, that includes directing, that includes it. There's so much kinetic energy in both, but they're so different, right? How do you preserve that original vision, though? Or some part of it. And a lot of authors will say, well, not at all. But I find that it doesn't work when you don't. And there are some really beautiful examples of shows where you can preserve, whether it's a play or a book, that original vision. And I find I might get into trouble for saying this, but I find it's how much the original creators are involved and how much love they have for the new medium. But it can be a combination of things.
So, with the Magnificent Ruins, would you be willing to do the screen adaptation, or is that not necessarily an experience you would like, to pull this apart at the seams and rebuild a different thing?
Not for me. I suspect it's a conflict of interest, but I think, I have very supportive employers. But I think the larger truth is that I am just not interested. The book meant so much to me as I was writing it. And, should someone have some sort of incredible creative vision for how it transforms, they're very welcome to do so. I don't particularly. I think it's going to take on a life of its own anyway after, and has already after November 12th. And so it'll become someone else's story to tell.
Did you do everything you wanted to do with this novel?
Yeah.
I'm really happy to hear that.
Yeah. Someone else asked me this, just a friend, and there's this one passage about insects that Kathy ultimately cut. We were both terrified of them, and there's sort of this almost ballet of, and she was like, it doesn't belong in this novel, but it's beautiful, and you should file it away. And I was like, will I ever regret this? And she's just a fantastic editor. And when I looked at it later, I was like, she's absolutely correct. And I did everything I wanted to, I think. Yes.
Okay. That's very, very cool to hear. We keep dancing around secrets. We keep dancing around this inheritance. We keep dancing around all sorts of plot points. And, Seth is fun. But home is, whether it's Brooklyn or it's Calcutta, home is a big deal. And I should also mention Lila's dad and her stepmother and her half-siblings live in Connecticut. So, she's got the whole thing going on. But home for her is sort of, I don't know, it's almost like liminal space, right? Like home moves around. She's sort of got one foot out the door all the time. She's got a very flexible view of what home means. And I'm not always sure it's intentional. I think partially it's her figuring out, like, where do I want to be? Mm-hmm. So what's your relationship with the idea of home? And how much of it does Lila share?
And I do think that there are many folks of my generation, especially immigrants, who share this view where home does become about who you are in that moment. And, I think Lila feels more American than she ever has when she is in India, and more Indian than she ever has when she's in the US. I think the book, which you so astutely observe, is about choice at every juncture, right? And the choice between what to call home, which man to call home, which version of herself, the one she's curated in the US, or the one one that includes the piece of her that she left behind to call home. And then there's the question of mansions and inheritances that are tangible and intangible. The things that run in Lila's veins, inherited from her mother and grandmother, is that home? and can it be? She finds out.
Did Lila surprise you?
Yes, indeed. She's more fearless than I imagined she would be. More reckless.
Yeah, reckless is a good word.
She also goes headfirst in believing in love and confrontation in a way that I didn't imagine a South Asian immigrant character would, but I should have, because she spent so much time in Connecticut and Brooklyn, having time to sort of, understand herself.
That, and I love her friendship with Molly, and I do think Molly is part of how Lila gets to be Lila, and I'm so glad that they're friends. And yes, I'm talking about fictional characters like they're real, but it's not the first time I've done it on the show, so we'll all get over it. But I think Molly's a great grounding factor in Lila, and sort of pushing her in ways that, Lila loves her family loves her. Yes, her mom in India is a handful, but she grew up knowing that she was in a good place, and her stepmom is terrific, and her dad is her dad, and then this extended family. And when she first gets to India, her extended family is, they're not rude or cold or anything else. They are trying to figure out who she is, but they're kind of excited she's there. And then we have, some cross-cultural translation, and it's a little trippy to have to translate yourself to your own family, right? And I'm not speaking purely linguistically, right? There's cultural stuff where you're like, oh, right, you don't do that here, and I have to remember to not do that here.
And that's very rude in another culture.
Yeah, there's sometimes you just kind of watch and figure out what's going on, and sometimes it's just best to ask your mom what's going on.
And it works both ways, because I think the deep intimacies and familiarities that Lila's family, the liberties that they take with some of their comments, the more polite, appropriate Westerner is both taken aback and does that mean what I think it meant? But there's this sort of nebulous territory.
Yeah, the Asian parent thing does translate, whether it's East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Northern Asian. Yeah, there is a continuity there. That, sometimes it's really funny, and sometimes you have to remember to just not take it personally, because it's like, oh, right, yeah, okay. And so watching Lila go through that is pretty universal, I would say. I don't think it's necessarily just a do you have family in Asia kind of thing. It is. Right. It is very universal what she's doing. It's a coming of age story that, it's nice to see people figuring stuff out in their sort of 20s. And it's not perfect. She's not perfect, but she is actively trying to figure out stuff and not just kind of coast through whatever moment is happening. And it's great to see. I genuinely like this character quite a lot.
That makes me very happy. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What did it make you feel, her decisions by the end of the book?
They felt very her. I was in for a penny, in for a pound at that point, where I was just like, okay, not necessarily things I would have done, but I like it when characters stay true to themselves. And there are times, and you and I both read a ton, and you can tell when something's sort of being wedged into a story in a way where you're like, I know you need that to happen, but it's not. I just saw a film that I'm not going to mention by name, but I just saw a film where the ending was a little over the top. And I was like, I get where you're going, but if you had dialed this back 15%, it would have been perfect. And it's fine but the momentum was so, and then all of a sudden I was like, oh, I get it. But now I've taken a step back and I'm in my intellectual brain, when you had my emotional brain up until this last little bit. And then I was like, oh, okay. Still liked it, but I was kind of like, oh.
Yeah. When the book was being shopped and I was having conversations with editors, one was pretty clear that the personal choice about her love life that Lila makes in the end, she really questioned that, I think. And I really respected where she was coming from. But I think it's tricky territory because, as you sort of said, you just have to let that character surprise you and do what is most truthful to them. And I am pleased that Lila made you feel like she was truthful.
I mean, like I said, and there were times too where I was like, "Oh, don't open that door. What are you doing? Stop it." I mean, but I do, as a reader, I like those moments where I'm getting a little judgy with a character. Well, I wouldn't do that. Well, yeah, because I'm not the character. So, you know, about Magnificent Ruins that we outside of spoilers.
No, I mean, I feel like you really understood the book. You really got it, which is so beautiful.
I think visceral is the word you and I are both looking for. All right, well, then I'm going to say, Nayantara Roy, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Magnificent Ruins is out now.
You're such a delight, Miwa. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.